Well, I have a good one for today.
What's
I was
that?
talking to Raza this morning, and according to Toon and his goons, they claim that the Apollo 17 transmissions were not enhanced in post-production. And he went over this with Raza. So Raza and I were doing a little bit of digging this morning.
Yep.
And Raza went over and he found this article. I'd like to read it.
Okay.
It says, during the Apollo 17 mission, the video signals transmitted from the moon were subject to various image processing techniques both during transmissions and after they were received on Earth. Given the limited bandwidth and technology available at the time, the goal of these processing techniques was to improve the quality of the video signal for broadcast and public viewing. While specific details of the exact methods used in 1970s can be somewhat scarce, we know that several general video processing techniques were applied to the broadcast dissemination of the footage, particularly in post-transmission. These techniques were essential for improving the video quality given the challenges of space communications. Now, this is kind of interesting. I'm not going to read it, but I'm going to just highlight the 8 different things that they did to these signals. And it goes, post-transmission video processing techniques. 1. Signal amplification and noise reduction. 2. Contrast enhancement. 3. Resolution enhancement, limited. 4. Frame interpolation and bending. 5. Edge enhancement and sharpening. 6. Color correction and adjustment. 7. Compression and bandwidth optimization. And 8. Signal reconstruction for live broadcast. Now these guys are claiming there was no post-transmission video processing that was used on Apollo 17? Well, I say rubbish to that.
Definitely. There was a lot of manipulation going on, all in the name of enhancing it.
Or they were making it fuzzy. They could have manipulated, they could have had a perfect signal there when they were faking the filming of it, and then they had to make it look like it was degraded.
By Apollo 17, you think they would have had the picture a little bit clearer, wouldn't you? I mean, after all, let's look at Apollo 11. That video footage, the raw data, went over to Lookout Labs, Lookout Mountain Laboratories. They processed that video and then it went back out to be rebroadcast to everyone. But here's the thing. Why didn't the television crews that were in that room that were taking that video feed off of that 4-inch monitor, why wasn't that monitor, the feed on that monitor, that was not reprocessed video. That was coming right in from the feed. And yet all the rest of it was going out to places like Australia. It was going out to these other places, but why wasn't it going to that little 4-inch television that the studio cameras were taking the image off of? That makes no sense. Yeah. You think they would have got the processed one that came from Lookout Mountain.
When you look at the details, it all falls apart.
And then, of course, once you have all this retransmission and this post-transmission video processing, and then it's retransmitted, you don't know where that transmission came from.
No. Yeah, and the so-called relayed that around using aircraft.
Yeah.
The one thing when we were doing the live is there was a couple of questions there, and one of them that we never answered was someone was asking how the Apollo astronauts were selected. And of course, there's one anomaly in the selection because everybody was a pilot or a test pilot. They flew in the war, whatever. They were all pilots and aviators minimum to qualify for that, like, and especially the experimental aircraft test pilots. I mean, those guys had balls of steel. And then there's Jack Smith, or Harrison Schmitt, a geologist. And he was on board, of course, with Farouk El-Bez when they were doing all the setups and practices at Flagstaff. And of course, he's setting out the rock samples that they had gathered from various locations in various countries there and setting them out. And they measured out the stations and marked how long it would take to get to each station that they were simulating at Flagstaff. That's all in the cue cards, and even the description, because that's what Jack was doing, showing the different types of minerals and the rocks that he set out at each station that they were at. And those are described in the cue cards. That was his job. So the anomaly is having Harrison Schmitt, Jack Schmitt. He is the lunar module pilot. And that is an anomaly in itself because Cernan was the commander. And here's a geologist all of a sudden, because I guess they liked him in the training, but he was not initially selected as a flight astronaut on there. He was there to help with the training. And then by Apollo 17, oh, hey, Jack, come on aboard and we'll make you the lunar module pilot. And the other thing is for all of the missions, people have to understand that for each one of the missions, the pilot of the lunar module, that's his first time doing it. Before the missions ended, Neil Armstrong already left NASA. You would think he would be there to help with the training of the next mission and the next mission and the next mission, because, of course, he already had the experience of making it to the moon and back.
Well, that's what we're told.
Listen to this. As a civilian, Harrison Schmitt completed jet and helicopter flight training at Williams Air Force Base, Arizona, and at Pensacola Naval Air Station, Florida. He logged more than 2,100 hours flying, including 1,600 hours in jet aircraft, primarily the T-38 Talon, and 210 hours in a helicopter, an H-13.
I never found that before because when I looked it up, that information wasn't available. He's simply a geologist.
Nope.
Are they updating files on him to make them look better?
This one's December the 3rd, 2021.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. It's an updated file because when I looked it up before, he was simply a geologist. He didn't have any flight time.
Harrison Jack Schmitt was selected by NASA as a scientist astronaut in 1965. Unlike the space shuttle era, all astronauts at the time had to qualify as pilots. Trained as a geologist and having never flown an aircraft before, he joined a class of cadets for the year-long undergraduate pilot training program at Williams Air Force Base. The syllabus began with small propeller planes, later moving on to jets, including the supersonic T-38 Talon. Schmitt would have a long relationship with the T-38 as NASA astronauts used them for pilot proficiency and travel. He also received helicopter training that was overseen by the Navy. Schmitt eventually flew as a lunar module pilot on Apollo 17 mission in December 1972. During the liftoff from the moon, there was a communication problem, and it was his job to solve it. So he joined in 65, but since he had no training, he had to join a class of cadets for a year-long undergraduate pilot training program at Williams Air Force Base.
So he had a year flight time.
No, he logged 2,100 hours.
That's 8 hours a day every day.
Wow.
That's 40 hours a week flying time.
Doesn't matter. That's what he's logged here.
That's intensive freaking training. And how much time did he have in the lunar simulator?
Well, probably not much because he didn't have to land the thing.
But he was the pilot.
Yeah, but Gene Cernan would have landed it. He was the commander. It was always the commander who landed it. Lunar module pilot didn't do anything.
But he was in charge of communications.
Yeah, not landing it.
No.
So you'd think from the job description, lunar module pilot, he would have been the one to land it. But he wasn't, because he couldn't. He hasn't trained on it. He hadn't trained to do it.
Well, that's stupid. Both of them should be trained to land the thing.
Yeah, of course it would. I mean, would you get on an aircraft that didn't have a fully trained co-pilot as well as a pilot? Of course not. You want two people on board who can land the thing.
Exactly.
But landing on the moon apparently is so simple, and it needs one person to be trained. It's a bit of a misstep in the training process.
Here again, you have to go through things and reopen these cases because they are adding new things every day. This article here was written in 2012, Monday, December 10th, 2012.
Exactly. But when I initially read the stuff, he was simply a geologist hired to assist Farouk El-Bez in the training.
Well, not anymore.
No, now he's upgraded to everything, so he's as highly qualified as Neil was.
I always thought that his appointment onto Apollo 17 caused quite a few problems with the astronaut corps, because who was bumped off Apollo 17 to allow Harrison Schmitt to get on?
Well, there were 60 total in training. They were, 24 were selected from that, and then you lose 3 with the fire, Grissom, Chaffee, and White. So you had now 57 out of that. And then there were still the 24 that were selected from that. And somebody, yes, had to get bumped. You can't even review if you go online now and you try and ask for the list of the 60 astronauts that were initially selected. You can't find it anymore.
Yeah, because a lot of those astronauts on that list of 60 were being trained for the Manned Orbital Laboratory, the MOL, which was classified. So a lot of people involved, a lot of names of astronauts with which nobody is familiar have appeared, and they turn out to be Manned Orbiting Laboratory astronauts. They were training with Apollo astronauts. And that program, the MOL, got cancelled, so all the astronauts disappeared.
But you see, this is the thing, is that you go back years later and you read this, because at first it does say that Harrison Schmitt was not a pilot. That's what it first says. And then you start opening up these little links, and then articles start popping up.
And then it's updated. Like when I first read it, I didn't see any updates. I just read the fact that he was not a pilot. He was a geologist.
Harrison Schmitt was brought on specifically because he was a geologist, not because he was a pilot, and he bumped somebody else off. I forget who it was. One of the crew of Apollo 17 had to be relieved of his position so Schmitt could come on. And that caused quite a lot of unrest amongst the other Apollo astronauts, mainly because Schmitt wasn't a pilot, as they were. They were test pilots, they were experienced pilots, but Schmitt wasn't. After he left NASA, he went on to be a US senator. You'd think if he was a geologist, he might have done a bit more work in that area. Obviously not.
Yeah, Schmitt would have had some intensive training to do, all right. 2,100 hours of flight time, including 1,600 hours in jet aircraft and 210 hours in that helicopter. Don't forget, though, NASA's flipping the bill for him, so he can spend all the time he wants.
It says here that Schmitt was a professional geologist as well as an astronaut, had served on the backup crew of Apollo 15, I don't remember that, and thus, because of the rotation, every other mission, he would have been on Apollo 17. I think they're rewriting history here.
They're changing a lot of stuff.
Yeah. I mean, who was the backup crew of Apollo 15? I don't remember Schmidt's name being there at all.
No, those are in the Finney file. They list when they were training. They also trained with the alternate crew. So there's 6 people listed in each of the training. That's in the Finney file. They're still there. I don't recall Schmitt in anything assisting in the training, other than the fact that he was a geologist giving them the descriptions of the minerals that they would find in the rocks once they split them open.
It says Harrison Schmitt was backup lunar module pilot for Apollo 15, as was to be on the Apollo 18 crew.
Yeah, 15. Why did Gene Cernan not like Harrison Schmitt? The original choice of lunar module pilot on Apollo 17 was Joe Engle, who was an X-15 pilot. So that's
that kind of qualifies him if he's flying the X-15, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. Yeah.
He's one of the top pilots out there if they're flying that kind of equipment.
Neil Armstrong was one of the X-15 pilots as well.
Yeah, well, they flew all the new machines and the testing hand-built jets out there and flying them till the wings fall off the damn things to see what they're capable of. It's interesting, though, when people ask questions like that, how the astronauts were selected, and then you have an anomaly like that come in there, and then they try to give them some kind of accreditation. And, of course, the most amazing thing about the Apollo program is that everything worked flawlessly, with the exception of Apollo 13. It's probably because they couldn't get the astronauts to fake it. The landing, they probably couldn't get them together to do that. So they had to come up with another story, or they just wanted to get people away from watching reruns of I Love Lucy or whatever to get some more media attention.
And get some more money from Congress.
Yeah, they needed that. But when you look at the success rate of Apollo compared to any other thing that's happening even today, like when they launch a rocket, there's a very good chance that it just might explode on the launch pad. And these aren't giant rockets. This is just lifting off satellites and stuff like that. There's so many failures that happen and things like that. But Apollo not only went that extreme distance to the moon, everything worked beautifully, getting into that orbit, descending to the lunar surface, taking back off, reconnecting stuff. And then we're talking about refueling stuff in space and the difficulty it is to make the connection to refuel. Yet Apollo managed to take off just by throwing a cassette tape and go, here we off into the wild blue yonder. No countdown, no nothing, no communication of any kind. And they managed to get lined up and reconnect and successfully do a trans-Earth injection, the whole 9 yards. In the meantime, they're running film cameras. They're not even doing their job. There's got to be an entire thing. By the way, the other thing I was going to talk about was aborting a launch from a Saturn-V rocket. But I can't find any documentation on aborting any of the mission from farther in.
Right.
Like if they had an unsuccessful launch, the first time you can actually do the abort, like they have that abort thing at the top, that comes off. But that only works within a very short period of time of liftoff. If there's something going on, it will pull the capsule off and do that. Once they get through that 15 seconds or whatever, that's not an option anymore. You actually have to ride it to space and then do a re-entry. That's your first next abort sequence. You must achieve orbit. You must get rid of that second stage has to burn off before you can do anything for an abort. But I can't find any documentation on aborting the mission farther on, like say on the lunar surface. There should be PDF files on how the astronauts are going to behave. Let's say you have the two guys on the lunar surface and something happens that they need to get off. They need to abort their EVA and just get back out of there. There's no PDF files on how to do that abort. If they lost communication with the orbiter, they're going to immediately abort. If that guy's not viable, do they go up there and check and see if that vehicle's still a viable machine for them or not? Because either way, they're dead if that machine's out of business. And that's the same thing if the person that's orbiting, if he loses communication or he realizes the astronauts on the lunar surface are dead, then there's no sense him hanging around in orbit, is there?
Yeah, you go back home.
There should be documentation. Okay, NASA, this is another thing. You got $20 billion a year. You need to start writing all of the abort sequences in PDF format and make it look like they're done in the 60s so we can read them. All of these abort sequences from every scenario, including if you miss getting into orbit around the moon. Because if you miss it, they didn't have enough fuel to turn around to correct that. You're just off into space. You keep going past the moon. If you miss the moon, you're gone. So then how did they then, if they didn't have enough fuel for that, how then did they have enough for a trans-Earth injection then? NASA needs to get all of this together and post those PDF files, keep updating the journal site. I mean, they've been updating it quite a bit because I was looking for something there this morning and the links I have for the different Apollo missions are dead. And as soon as they update it, then the link is dead. So every time they do it. So I went to Apollo 16 because I wanted to check on a photograph Robert and I were looking at. So I have my document, but I always check with them to see if there's any alterations in that file. So I hit the link for Apollo 16 image gallery, dead. So then I just have to go to the journal site main homepage and work my way in, because every time they alter something within that document, then the link is dead.
Yeah.
So I just check to make sure the picture we're looking at is exactly the same. It hasn't been altered. Because if there's an anomaly in there, I want to know if they have erased it, kind of thing. So we were checking that out, but the link was dead, which means they've done updates.
They're showing it here, the Apollo abort module. They're showing the phases here. First of all, everything has to be gone. So the first stage, the second stage, and the third stage, and then the capsule, and then off you can go. Then you can...
That's your first abort sequence.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have the documentations on that for the Saturn-V.
So that means if it explodes, you're dead anyway, because there's no way to detach the capsule from that.
Well, that little spike that's on top of a Saturn-V rocket, that's if there's a problem when you're launching, that will pull the capsule off. But as soon as that rocket starts to move up the speed, that becomes ineffective.
Yeah, you can't do it.
So your next abort sequence is you have to be basically after everything else on that rocket is fired is your first abort sequence when you just have the capsule.
If that abort sequence starts, one of the things they're going to have to do is sever the connections between the command module and the service module and the third stage.
But that's the first time they can do it. After the third stage, it releases out. Of course, the command module is not connected to the LEM at that time, so you're free of that.
That's
and then
true.
you just simply do a reentry. But any time in between that, there's no opportunity for an abort when you're on that rocket. If it's going to blow up, you're dead.
It would have to occur below the point at which the heat shield would be required to protect the command module. Because if they came off with the service module as well as the command module, then nobody is being protected from re-entry, unless it's a very low-level re-entry.
Well, they'd have to get rid of the service module.
Yeah, they would. And that's done with explosive bolts.
Basically, they have to be in space, in orbit, to be able to do that. If they don't achieve orbit, they're in trouble as well.
Because those explosive bolts separating the command module from the service module would have to ensure that they didn't damage the heat shield through which these bolts that secure the two together are passed. And if those holes, the explosive bolts, separate the two, the command module and the service module, if those holes are not filled in and they have to return from orbit, they're going to burn up.
The shielding, of course, was designed to come back from the moon at a much higher temperature. However, the other problem they're going to have when I was reading that stuff is if they're not in a stable orbit of any kind, when they're doing an abort, if the rocket messes up on them, and they get to that point, there's a certain angle of re-entry. It's a limited window on the angle of re-entry. Would they be able to achieve that angle for re-entry? Because if they came in too fast, they're toast, given the fact that they wouldn't be going any faster than orbiting speed at that point. If they were too shallow, they wouldn't skip out, but they'd miss their target and they're going to land somewhere on the land somewhere. Yeah. And that vehicle is not designed to land on land.
Designed to land in water, and there's more water than land. So hopefully they'd hit water.
Yeah, like if they are in an emergency, they could be just over Africa when they're landing. It's an emergency. They have to get away from the rest of that vehicle as quick as possible. And of course, they dump all of their fuel, oxygen, everything else on reentry because they don't want that to explode when it heats up. All of that stuff is vented out. So they're just in free fall mode, whatever angle that they're coming in at, until the parachute's open, right? There's absolutely no control on that machine whatsoever.
If they're coming back from lunar orbit return speed, they've got to enter at 6 degrees to the land. Yep. That's quite a shallow angle. As you said, if you come into steep an angle, you're going to burn up. If you go in too shallow an angle, you're going to bounce off the atmosphere. So you've got to get it absolutely spot on. And it's difficult to do it, very difficult to do it, if you've got no control over your craft.
Well, that 6 degrees, people have to understand you're doing that on a ball. Just a couple of degrees one way or the other changes the entry of 6 degrees. If you were coming into the outside edge of that ball that you're coming into, all of a sudden you'd have to turn into it to get to your 6 degrees.
Yeah, you would. Yeah.
If you were dead center on it, then you would have to angle it out till you get to the 6 degrees.
It's very complex flight pattern.
And you also have to go, which way are you going to orbit around when you're doing that re-entry? Are you going to go with the rotation of the Earth or against the rotation of the Earth? Because it's a spinning ball at 1,000 miles an hour. That changes stuff too.
Well, you presumably come in to follow the angle or the rotation of the Earth. Because coming in against the rotation of the Earth, you've got completely different dynamics.
You might not have that opportunity coming back from the moon.
Well, if it's not coming in at the right angle, on the right trajectory, if something has gone wrong, you're going to be toast. But none of that happened. They all did perfect landings within a mile or so of the recovery vehicles.
Yes, they traveled 250,000 miles and made a pinpoint re-entry every time.
Yeah.
And pinpoint landing. Unbelievable.
Yeah.
And it doesn't happen today.
No, it doesn't. And also, the Russians didn't do it well. There was one craft coming in from just Earth orbit, not from lunar orbit, and he was 400 miles from the landing point in Kazakhstan. He had to spend a night in the snow and ice before he could be rescued. So are we saying that the Soviets couldn't do it? Well, they never attempted to land humans on the moon. Even after America had allegedly done it before them, they got the propaganda victory and then they stopped. Picked up a few more rocks with Harrison Schmitt doing his stuff, being a geologist. So I don't quite know how that was an advantage. Obviously, it was seen to be. Send a geologist up to the moon, he can identify the rocks. Well, I thought, well, they've got several hundred kilos at this point. They should be able to identify some of the rocks by then. But no, Harrison Schmitt had to go up on Apollo 17. Joe Engle had to stand on the launch pad and watch it. Poor chap, he'd done all the training.
So did all the other astronauts that weren't selected. They did all the training.
No, a lot of them. And once the MOL, Manned Orbiting Laboratory, had been cancelled, along with Apollo 18, 19 and 20, there were a lot of surplus to requirement astronauts. Some of them flew on the shuttle, but not all of them. So these poor guys, they spent many years doing intensive training to become an astronaut, and suddenly surplus to requirements. Bye-bye, guys. See you around. It's sad.
Yeah, and you'd wonder what they did after that. Were they still employed with NASA? Everybody else left.
Yeah, Neil Armstrong left before the end of the Apollo program. He left in 71.
Yeah, that's what I mean. It's impossible for him not to be there to train the astronauts that are still going to go. They would need his expertise. You got to realize what NASA was giving up. If that man actually landed on the moon, his experience and his training to be able to teach anybody else that's going to be going there would be invaluable. But if he didn't go, it wouldn't matter. They wouldn't need him.
Maybe that's what happened.
That's exactly what happened.
Yeah, exactly. Armstrong was so fed up with having to continue to perform like a performing seal, clapping his hands, oh, wonderful, Rasa, well done, when he knew it hadn't happened.
You can't train people if you didn't do it.
Have you ever heard of this? It's called the Lunar Television Camera Pre-Installation Acceptance Test Plan. It's known as PIA. Now, that was that Westinghouse camera we were talking about in a few videos back, but here's something I didn't realize. Security classification. The fiber optics portion of the camera is classified confidential. However, it is incorporated within the camera case and is not visible from the outside. Personnel without security clearance are permitted to handle and operate the camera only under the surveillance of a person with a clearance. Performance data recorded during the camera tests will not be classified. The camera must be kept in a secured area when not in use. What was so sensitive about this Westinghouse camera number 607 R for Romeo 962? That was the model of that camera. What did that camera have in it? You're telling me that fiber optics were so classified back then that nobody could see them?
Yeah, that's what it looks like, because fiber optics were only recently developed at that point. But Westinghouse obviously had access to it. They incorporated it because it seemed to work for them.
This one was sent by NASA Space Agency, and it's dated the 12th of March 1968. And what caught his eye was this yellowed out section with the fiber optic portion of the camera being classified confidential, and nobody could see it unless you had the proper clearance. But it was okay as long as the cover was on it. But you still had to have somebody with a classification clearance in the room with you.
That's a very strange story, that one. I'd heard about the classification of fiber optics as it applied to Apollo. I'd heard of that before. But I didn't realize it was quite so intrusive that technicians installing the camera on Apollo would have had to be accompanied by a security cleared technician as well. I mean, what was so secret about fiber optics? It's now common knowledge. Everybody understands fiber optics. It's not rocket science. It's just basic physics, sending signals down using light.
But I don't understand it. This document describes the minimum testing requirement to verify proper operation of this camera. But the tests were also to ensure that the camera was not to be damaged or degraded due to mishandling. But what I don't understand is, why are these guys in the Apollo 12 funnies trying to take this camera, the twin to this one? They try to mount it on a stand, it falls over, hits the dirt, rolls over to the rocks, he picks it up, it falls down, crashes to the ground, picks it up again, and it falls down and he walks away because he gets frustrated, the astronaut. Now, if this was so important of a camera, or even its twin, these cameras were important. So why would they be doing all that damage to a camera? What, was there a guy there with a classification that watched him while he was mounting the camera and then damaging it? when right here it says that the whole point of this was to ensure that the camera was not damaged or mishandled in any way. Go figure that one
out, out, out.